Too much pink. Hello, everybody, and thank you, CTRL+J, for having me. I mean, I do feel absolutely ancient after that panel. Spoo, I remember when we were the young ones.
Hey, you know,
it wasn't that long ago.
I was sitting there and thinking that our panel is going to feel like a switch of a channel where you're watching a nice, trendy channel, youthful channel, and then there comes the parents, and then they switch to the news.
And so we want to talk about policy after that. But before we get to that, Spoo is just back from a funeral. This week, or at least it's a week ago now, that South Africa lost one of its most courageous journalists. Tsidi Madia was a colleague to many, many of us. I remember her fondly from back when I was young. It wasn't that long ago, I promise. And she would be here laughing, and I can still hear her laugh. It was the most infectious laugh. She epitomized joy, but she also epitomized courage, and a unique form of courage. And Spoo, of course, was her boss for a long time. And him and many others, of course, across South African media, mourning a very important voice. Those of you who don't know her work, I would encourage you to just Google Tsidi Madia, Fox News, just to give you an understanding of what we have lost and her ability to talk truth to power at all times. And so I wanted to just pause just for a minute for us to, in respect to, this colleague that we have lost, to reflect on her legacy and the legacy of brave journalism. And of course, with her, we recall and remember journalists in Gaza who have been targeted and killed over the last 2 years, as well as journalists in Sudan and elsewhere around the world who continue to lose their lives because of the work that they do. So just a few seconds of reflection. Thank you, everybody. So, Spoo, you're meant to be the boring uncle. That is your role at this conference.
Feel like one. I made sure not to jump over that last step.
On that note, I can tell you that I sprained my ankle for the second time this year.
I keep Painamo gel in my bag.
I'll definitely get some from you. But as the old people now who must talk about the boring stuff, I think there are many people, this phrase M20 has been thrown around very liberally, and many of us are pretending to know what that means, naturally. But in the spirit of decoding the world, what is the M20?
Okay, I think, let me just go back a little bit as to where it originated and how we got here. And I know that most of the people who are here were part of the M20, so this is for the benefit of those who were not there. In India, during India's presidency in 2023, colleagues in India felt that it was important for journalists, media organizations, civic society to get together and to deal with the pressing issues that are facing the media and find a way of trying to influence G20 leaders in that regard. I think that was a virtual one. Some of our colleagues actually participated in that. Our current chairperson, Makudu Safara, was one of those. Fast forward to Brazil. I think Brazil, there was a lot of progress that was made, including the issue of information integrity finding center stage in terms of those discussions and everyone understanding that the need for accurate, reliable information is not a nice to have, right? So those are not just binary or side issues. It's important for G20 leaders to understand that information integrity and lack thereof actually is a threat to democracies and to civilization out ahead. What we found when the presidency moved to South Africa, when we were looking through the documents, we actually found that there was a deviation, not in, or maybe I'd call it a deviation, maybe that's a loose word, but when we're dealing with issues relating to information integrity, South Africa had focused on a subset of, which is where they were dealing, we're actually more prefacing deep fakes. And we had said as colleagues and thought that no, but I think after all the progress that the Brazilians had made, it makes sense that we actually try and organize a physical M20. I mean, there was a lot of debate within SANEF whether it's worth it or not, and or whether these issues we should even be dealing with. But I think that the success and the turnout and the fact that we're able to pull this off and get the participation of organizations and delegates from around the world shows that this need for collaboration around issues that are pressing to us as the media is actually more needed now more than ever. And I think that the fact that we were able to get all of these people in one room and come up with a progressive declaration, which we'll get to, tells us that we're all facing the same issues the world over, and I think there is a need for us to kind of collaborate and work together in this fast-changing world, because, I mean, it was not so long when we were all fighting the fangs, and now we are feeling that actually Google was better in terms of how they scraped our information. You know, we are complaining now about AI summaries. I don't think we've gotten to a point where we've got that magic bullet, but I think that the coalitions that we're building, and I think for me it's encouraging also to see a lot of familiar faces, because it looks like there's a movement that is ongoing, and I think that the future of journalism, which obviously will feature the young people, is actually important for us to have these kind of conversations.
Let's talk about the impressive number of organizations that ultimately participated in the M20. I remember getting there on Sunday night at the opening dinner, and I looked at the screens displaying the number of organizations that had, you know, participated or supported in some way, and I was taken aback because I recall, you know, at a certain point earlier this year, SANEF was quite concerned about a lack, really, of partnership for this. And how did that happen?
Look, I think we actually must give credit to some of our members of our organizing committee. I think that in this time of declining media and where we are becoming fossils, we still have caring members who care about the future of journalism, you know, and I'd like to make special mention of someone like Isaac Minar, whom all of you know here, you know.
And a round of applause.
Yes. You don't know how many times I argue with Isaac. It's like, why do we have why are we even doing this? And then it's like, no, but you need to talk to this person. You need to meet this person. It's like, Isaac, it's fine if you know them. I'll get their numbers from you, you know. So Isaac is one person who who's given himself really selflessly to the promotion of journalism and development of journalism in this country, and I would say the continent as well. And we also have people who are part of that committee, including Professor Guy Berger. You had a number of faces here, Michael Markovic. We had people like Khadija, Reggie was part of that. And having that and being able to actually still have companies that care and organizations that care about the media who are able to support us to make this possible. So not only did we have the support of global partners, I think in the end we surpassed the 50 mark in terms of the number of organizations that endorsed that declaration, but also there has been support from business leadership in this country. And I think that as we hand over to our colleagues in the US, there's homework for us to do in South Africa, because there are things that are peculiar to us that we need to pursue. And I think one of the pressing issues that we have to do, there were commitments that were made in the progressive speech that was given by our Minister of Communications and Digital Technologies, in actually saying that he will make sure that whatever inputs that comes from the ministers into the leader statement, that he prefaces some of the issues we're raising, particularly around information integrity. I think that is something, yes, it's still premature for us to celebrate, but it shows that these efforts are not in vain, in that from where we started, where we're saying, okay, maybe South Africa has regressed a bit, what can we do? There are different things we've tried to do, and I think that those efforts are bearing fruit. But as I say, it's still early days to see whether, politicians and promises.
Indeed, indeed. Speaking about South Africa and thinking about our own challenges, it was very revealing for me this week to watch the conference and watch the speeches through the eyes of our colleague Siddharth in India from the Wire, because at various points Siddharth turned to me saying, "Wow, that's really impressive." For a business person, a senior business leader, to come up and take such strong points that are not necessarily popular and might actually not endear him to political power, he kept telling me that will not happen in India. And like that, there were many moments where, he was similarly impressed with Minister Malatsi. And throughout, and it made me realize that, we do have something to be proud of and something to protect in South Africa. And therefore, South Africa has a particular position of leadership, I feel, in this moment, considering what's happening around the world. And yet, we know that, things are not looking great for media in South Africa. I know that you got a new gig this week. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
And Spoo is basically going to head up a new local, are we calling it a newspaper?
Not quite.
A news publisher based here in Johannesburg. And that really is because of the death of local journalism in South Africa. It's almost impossible to find, even in Johannesburg, the country's richest city, it's impossible to find local news. So, Spoo and his colleagues are, taking up this challenge. But we know as well, and Spoo, you come from mainstream media, you've worked in print, you've now worked in broadcast. It's not very easy to keep media alive. And so I was heartened by the emphasis on sustainability within the, are we calling it the Johannesburg Declaration, yeah? And tell us, what does this actually mean for organizations who are, who are struggling and are not quite sure where the future is? How do we see, we've obviously got the commitment from Minister Malatsi, we got the commitment from Vadia as well, saying that we'll take this up within the broader G20 process. But what does this actually mean for the vitality of the news media ecosystem, not just in South Africa, but indeed for all of our geographies?
I think in fact, coming back to the very issue you raised, I've always worked, now I can tell people when they ask for anything that I work for a non-profit organization, so I don't have money. When we've worked all my life for mainstream media organizations. And I think that talks to the changing landscape and the need to respond to some of those. So what we have launched is a Johannesburg-based news agency, which is focusing on governance in the city of Johannesburg. Because in the decline that we'll talk about, you find that, there are very few newsrooms that have municipal reporters. When you and I were in the trenches, you'd have municipal reporters, court reporters. I think politics is the only beat that exists. So it's meant to respond to that, and it's a donor-funded initiative that has its own pitfalls. But the reality is that there is a need for us to constantly adapt and try to find a way in relevance in this fast-changing world. But I think the reception actually we've received, because we're publishing through existing through third-party publishers. Everyone who's spoken to is actually, they can't wait to publish those stories tomorrow. And I think that that talks to the lack of, not just the lack of depth, but also the lack of skills in newsrooms. So when it comes to the promises made by business, I think it was quite encouraging actually, because one of our main sponsors actually of the M20 is Standard Bank, who are the leaders of the B20. And we are in the process. There's a SANEF-led process to establish a country fund. Someone like Irene would know that we pick your brains time and again, and sometimes after those dinners we have to pivot and think differently. But the reality is that there are all these efforts we're trying to put together to make sure that we can sustain journalism for the future. I don't know if I have the answer to your question, but I believe that in this first change, it's like quicksand, really. We always have to constantly try and adapt. But the reality is that I think one of the lessons from that M20 is also the fact that we convened a very successful M20, but we convened a successful M20 among ourselves and the people that we know, and not necessarily having these youthful voices that are coming with new ways of thinking. And I think that that's a lesson for us going forward, for whoever holds the M20 or convenes the M20 going forward, to make sure that we are responding to the changing needs of our audiences. I mean, if you look at the recent Reuters digital news reports, some people were encouraged, seeing that it's only 7% penetration of chatbots, but the reality is that that's only starting, you know. And then there's another statistic that says that of that 7% of South Africans that are using chatbots to access news, 25% of them were young people under 25. So I think that we are, for as long as we are trying to innovate and use platforms like these and rely on partners like we have here, we'll probably find some of these solutions. I don't know if we ever will, actually.
I mean, I think, I think we have to find ways to ensure that through the M20 process that there are structural ways that, that we're not relying on courtesies from the minister or business, but that there are structural ways in which we can actually inform the agenda. The M20, of course, it runs parallel to the formal G20 process. It's not formally part of the G20. So, while we had some participation from at the ambassador level, at the ministerial level, this is not part of the official G20 agenda. Which, if a quick Google search will get you the South Africa's official, I think there's the Sherpa track, etc. And there are many pitfalls to that, but there are many advantages as well, in that we get to set the agenda ourselves, and we escape political capture, which is obviously a huge risk when it comes to something like media. And considering they're not always the most democratic countries, not all of them are the most democratic within the G20, but I think that we have to find ways, and we have to find some some points that we must, unify ourselves around. We heard, of course, from our colleagues with the Media Viability Manifesto Group on Monday at the conference, who, have a few, advocacy points which I think that are crucial. For example, around development assistance and ensuring that, thinking about the sustainability and the revitalization of information ecosystems actually is consistently included within development agendas around the world, and that instead of a contraction and the very stark contraction of development assistance being allocated around the world, that instead that it is structurally informed within development agendas. And I think it takes moments like these to ensure that does consistently be done. And I think that, for us as South Africans, of course, to ensure that we use our voices to get there as well, but of course also use our voices to ensure that government does things like that they're always saying that they're going to do, like like the 30% advertising budgets to community media, and colleagues from community media will tell you that that never happens. So I think there are a few points like this that that we have to find and ensure that we continue to stick to. But I want to talk as well about the safety of journalists. The Johannesburg Declaration, of course, considering the moment that we are navigating in world history, we're seeing journalists, of course, being targeted and killed with impunity. And so, within the declaration, there is a call for justice and accountability for the killing of journalists. Tell us a little bit more about that.
We had a moment of silence for Tsidimadia. Tsidimadia is one journalist who was constantly bullied online. I mean, we recognize that there's physical harms and physical threats to journalists, but also the online threats, body shaming, particularly of women journalists. And I think that it's important for us to realize that, there was a time when as journalists would sit about this and sit around at a bar and drink ourselves into a stupor and take this to be a normal. It comes par for the course. It comes with the territory, but you realize actually the damage and the trauma that journalists actually carry in doing their job. So I think the declaration's emphasis and also urging the condemnation of physical and online assaults on journalists and calling for an environment where, as media professionals, we can work without fear is an important one, because really we are living in that dangerous world. And we had that video that we showed at the M20. I mean, and my fear, and I'm sure other colleagues as well, if Israel can kill so many journalists with impunity, what does that mean for the rest of the world? And what does it mean for copycat dictators in this particular continent, actually, where we've had cases of journalists being threatened and jailed? I mean, we've got colleagues in I think it's Guinea. Is that Guinea? Where's Traore? Is it Guinea? Burkina Faso. You can see that they are active. The disinformation campaign and chatbots that are thumping him, and you've got members of the public believing that this is some modern day.
Is one of them.
Modern day. That's it. Modern day Thomas Sankara. But this is a guy who's jailing journalists, and also anybody who criticizes them. He throws them onto the front line. That dragged and fitted into military fatigues and forced to be part of the military. So that's why I think it's an important one for governments to actually realize that journalists work to serve their societies. But I don't know if politicians actually want that, because if you look at the biggest purveyors of disinformation and misinformation, it's actually political actors. So I think
many of them in the G20.
Exactly. There's something that I think there's a reference we make that is made in the declaration, the fact that 9 of the G20 countries are members of the Media Freedom Coalition. And among those is the United States. I don't know if you can still speak about the United States as being a place where the media is said to be free and from all the harms that we face. So we also have those changing political regimes that mean different things at different epochs. We don't know the nature of this M20 going forward, but I think we're encouraged also by the fact that we've got colleagues that I think there's about 4 or 5 organizations that are willing to support the continuation of the M20, because all these issues that we're dealing with are actually issues that are important for us to continue to collaborate and to gather as we have, to make sure that while media houses will die, and was it Christine? As per Christine's the website she referenced, the reality is that journalism must thrive. Journalism will still be here for years to come, as we saw with our JECs, right? So that's it. I mean, our newsrooms have been, if there's one thing we've tried to avoid, it's to mimic what is happening out there, what is popular. But I think you are seeing now a shift somewhat where as journalists themselves doing explainers, right? And I think that actually matters. It's a space that we should not ignore. We actually should make sure that yes, there are trends. We don't want to be, I mean, you would know that there was a time when we had to have all the social media accounts, including Snapchat. I don't know if I'm using a company now that still uses Snapchat, but we had to adapt. But the reality is that
companies have been built on Snapchat, I'll have you know. They've built successful businesses on Snapchat. Yeah.
No,
You should
certainly.
look at it.
But the reality is that I don't know of any South African media company that is on Snapchat. You know, there are things that don't work for everyone. But there is a need for us, and we are seeing those changes. And I think it's encouraging, really. That's why it's important for us to gather as we have and have these conversations.
Absolutely. Spoo, I know you are a dad, often
Have to
asking
do
him
a
about
school
his
run.
twins. And the M20 declaration, I think, is quite innovative in that it also has quite a big focus on children's rights. Tell us about that and tell us why that is important when we're thinking about information integrity and the future of news media.
Look, the reality is that because you have newsrooms that are changing, not only in terms of makeup, but also in terms of focus, there is a need to protect children and vulnerable groups. And I think it's actually quite progressive to have to include that in this declaration, and also advocating for the strengthening of media literacy, and making sure that we actually hold AI companies and tech companies accountable for the information that is published on their platforms and protecting children's rights. So it goes without saying. I mean, I've got a 13-year-old and he's got a phone. And yes, while you may have parental controls, there is a need to make sure that tech companies are actually responsible and they take accountability. It can't just be a hands-off thing of saying, hey, I heard somebody actually, there was a recent case of a kid who killed himself, I think, after getting advice on one of the chatbots. And I heard somebody say, no, AI tools are just tools. It's like if somebody hands you a knife, if you decide to stab yourself with the knife, you can't blame the knife. And I thought, okay, yeah, that sounds like an argument, but not quite. It's like an abdication of responsibility. So I think there's a greater need to protect children, and I think that if all partners and if we as the media are the ones who are pushing that, it's actually one, we should make sure that governments and also tech companies and media organizations the world over continue to ensure that.
Absolutely, and yet we know that in Europe particularly, children's rights are, and this framing of children's rights is actually being used to demonize some media, and is actually being used to thwart freedom of the press in some ways. So, like many of our efforts at regulation, we have to be very, very vigilant about how these laws, how these recommendations are actually implemented, because they can sometimes backfire spectacularly. So, with all of these things, it is about continuity. And so between now and hopefully a very fruitful American presidency of the G20, tell us what is the future of this initiative.
I think after the successful summit, there was a meeting we had yesterday of the International Advisory Group. Because I know we've been asking ourselves the question as to what is the future of the M20. Should we continue with it? And I think there is general consensus that the M20 is necessary. There is a need to collaborate, and already, as I said, there are organizations that have raised their hand to say that they are willing to convene it in the US. And I think one of the things we tried to do in the beginning was to try to get government support. And I think it's actually a good thing that it's an independent initiative, because with the U.S. South Africa politics or relations being at their lowest, I don't think that should have and will have an impact on the M20 going forward, because again it will be organized as an independent gathering. So, but I think the important thing that we are emphasizing is the need to make sure that with every country or every jurisdiction convening an M20, there will be issues that are more pronounced and that are peculiar to those countries. It's important to have that in the agenda, but also ensure that at least some of the resolutions and declarations, there is some level of continuity. Hence, I was able to track the issue of information integrity from Brazil, and how we're able to make sure that as we go forward, G20 leaders and also ourselves as journalists, we actually are promoting that. So there are those common themes that will continue going forward. So I think that it bodes well for, I'm sure the nature and form will change and it will adapt as time continues. But I think being able for us to convene such a successful one bodes well for the future, and we hope to see more of this collaboration and more partners actually coming together for the future of journalism.
Thanks very much. That's Spoon Ngalwa, now at a non-profit. I've just discovered that
you can buy me drinks.
I am actually younger than him, because I've never been in a newsroom where there was a municipal reporter.